Exposing the Expositions, Chapter 5, Part 2, narrated by author Howdy McCoskey. St. Louis, 1904. The next World Fair was 3 years later in St. Louis and was named the Louisiana Purchase Exposition to honor the 1803 purchase of what is now much of central USA from Napoleonic France. They also demanded and got the Summer Olympic Games of that year to coincide with the fair. The Forest Park site was actually bigger than the one in Chicago, and not just by a small amount. It dwarfed Chicago. The fair inspired the song Meet Me in St. Louis, which became central in the 1944 movie of the same name starring Judy Garland. A few books I will recommend for this to see photos are The Forest City, 1904 by William Rao, Louisiana and the Fair, An Exposition of the World by J.W. Buell, a 9-volume, 4,000-page treatise, and the final report of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition Commission, and also a German book, Anschein von der Weltschuldig, a book partially translated to German. An English book partially translated to German. All 4 books can be referenced via the studylove.org site for 1904 St. Louis. This was the area of the famous Mississippi mound builders, and one of their cities, Cahokia, is still in East St. Louis. With pyramids, temples, and a structure called Woodhenge, it was one of the Native Americans' great early sites. During a conversation with Michael Wan at Susquehanna Alchemy, we found that the Forest Park site was actually another large ancient mound builder settlement similar to Cahokia. Several articles I read described that at least 10 mounds were destroyed to make room for the fair buildings. There are some photos of the mounds, but whatever they were, you cannot tell what they were due to the dirt and grass that covered them. But it does remind that this was an ancient ceremonial spot that was destroyed and then to have this fair built on top of it. As for the city history, French explorers were not supposed to begin coming to the area until the 1700s. The census of 1772 claims the village had but 637 people. The Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803, and right after that the team of Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark go on a 2-year odyssey across the entire Indian Territory from Pittsburgh to the Pacific coast. They were to explore and map the country, study the plant and animal life, and create trade routes with the local native Indians. Of course, the real mission of their journey might have been quite different. It might have been to find out what other great deserted cities in the newly taken lands there might be. These too would be a historical focus of the exposition, and that would be at Portland in 1905. St. Louis began to grow. In 1816, work started on the courthouse. Here, a city with less than 2,000 of population in the middle of the continent with basically no roads can just throw up a massive domed and columned building in a few years. Where did all the stone come from? And how was it transported on horseback and wagons? Just how many people were going to court every day that something this size was needed? The 1840s are claimed to be a time of great immigration from Irish and the Germans, as well as a huge influx of black slaves. It became a city of jazz and blues music, as well as a key chapter in early pro baseball. 1849 seems to be a bad year. First, a cholera epidemic is said to kill 5,000 people. Then a huge fire breaks out. What city with ancient buildings does not have a fire? Supposedly started by accident on a steamboat. More likely, 1849 is marked out as a year they began to bring in new people to found this captured city. History prior to 1849 for St. Louis might basically be made up, and what we can even remotely call history of a city began in 1849. One more note on St. Louis is that it is known as the Gateway Arch. Several researchers, such as Vanessa V.A. and Kalia Crone, suggest that San Francisco and its Golden Gate is linked with St. Louis and its gate. They may in fact be end-point portals in some way. Add that to the Lions Gate Bridge in Vancouver, and there is some very strange symbolism with the city's various gates. The Exposition. Quote, "These exhibits represent in concrete, from the artistic and industrial development of this country, and in viewing them one cannot but be impressed with the great improvement in conditions affecting our material and physical welfare, and with the corresponding advancement in our intellectual and aesthetic life." End quote. Opening day at the 1904 World's Fair. Forest Park in southern St. Louis had been created in 1876. That ceremonial date again. By 1890, 3 million people per year were visiting this park thanks to the newly built subway lines that ran. This spot was said to be chosen for the exposition, according to the site at the fair, because, quote, "the park was at a central point between north and south of town, in a place as well as had good water pressure. Furthermore, stately private streets such as Westmoreland Place and Portland Place were located near the park. Many of the giant homes from that period are still on these streets." So my first question is, why would the rich elite, who really enjoy their privacy and isolation from the commoners, want to be besieged by millions of people, not just for the fair, but the years of its building? These are the same people who would be putting the money up to have it, so they could have easily demanded any other site. But it is presented as if the fair close to these rich homes is a good idea. Again, that makes no sense. It's more likely the site was chosen because of what was already there, either above ground or buried in mud. The mansion homes were just part of the original city that were in the location. The elite homes were stuck with the fair for a few years in order to deal with the ancient buildings that had to be dealt with. Again, the destroying of Indian mounds in the area is likely a key to unraveling the reasoning for the use of this site for the exposition. But back to standard history. Before construction could begin, an environmental group started a lawsuit to stop the cutting down of the large woodland area in the northwest. A compromise was reached, and the committee said they would use only 657 acres of the park and leave the rest. New property directly west was leased that would become Washington University. Why exactly Missouri would name its main university for Washington is unclear. Of course, with no surprise, the university chose giant Gothic-style architecture for its buildings. The first architect meeting occurred on June 27, 1901. The designer of works for the fair was Isaac Taylor. Taylor had a similar history to Burnham in Chicago, having designed 215 large buildings mainly in St. Louis. Exactly how he gained the skills to be the foremost architect of the Midwest is up for debate, as he graduated university in 1868 with a degree in classical languages, but was claimed to be an expert in Gothic architecture somehow. He was then picked up for work by J.L. Barnett's firm shortly after graduation. This is a similar story to Burnham's rise. The main advisor for the park layout was George Kessler. Born in Germany, he moved to the U.S. early in his life. While famous New York landscaper Olmsted, who designed the Chicago Exposition, did not hire him, he did suggest that Kessler educate himself about nature through reading, reflection, and excursions, and to aim to free himself from German associations in order to expand his capabilities and not limit his influence and opportunities. End quote. He eventually got work in New York and then expanded worldwide. He is credited with over 2,000 projects for 26 communities, 26 park systems, 49 parks, 46 estates and residences, and 26 schools from Shanghai to Mexico City. Julius Pitzman, another fair advisor, presented problems with the Des Perez River to the architectural group. The problem of its route, along with the high chance of flood, meant it would have to be worked on before building could begin. The decision was to straighten the river and then have it moved underground. The entire river was said to have been completely re-landscaped and rerouted by the rich construction company in just 65 days. Yes, a major river was rerouted and moved underground in 65 days. December 20, 1901 was the groundbreaking ceremony, which will later become quite a source of controversy. They burned wood to thaw the frozen ground in order to pound in the oak spike, signifying the beginning of construction, because there's no better time to start building a massive exposition than in the middle of winter. The statue of St. Louis would be placed on that spot. As for the construction, of course, the presentation is as strange as Chicago. There are hundreds of photos available. The usual is the standard presentation of mostly complete buildings that are covered with scaffolding. The claim is that 1 million feet of scaffolding was used in the projects. But again, are they using the scaffolding to build, or are they using it to refurbish and paint? Many of the construction photos show only completed buildings standing alone in an area that can best be described as a mud pit. Some buildings have a few ladders leaned up against it, I think trying to make it look like something was being done. When you look over the area in the photographs, think of how many shovels of earth would be needed just to landscape the area. When ready for opening, there was more than just massive buildings. 30 miles of new streets were created, while 70 miles of roads were resurfaced. Trees were axed or replanted, thousands of tree stumps were removed, countless cubic feet of soil had to be graded, plus the hotels, restaurants, and a midway called the Pike, the Great Basin, and the Cascades all had to be created. Again, this is all supposed to be magically done in just over 2 years, all by horse-drawn equipment with no machines, electrical tools, and the like, though a few steam-powered pieces were claimed to have been used. And when you see the photos, it's all very odd. When I showed these photos to my building contractor friend, he became very clear on what he was seeing. The first thing he asked was, where are all the workmen? I mean, to build this, you need 20 to 30,000 guys. Where are they? All on holiday? And where's the evidence they were even there? No accessible building materials, no tools, no food areas, no evidence someone's been here for a long time. It is like this is day one and someone's walking into it just to take a photo. This is very, very strange, he said. So exciting was the building that supposedly 100,000 visitors came each Sunday to watch the process. But when you see the construction photos, there are usually no more than 2 or 3 workers in any photo. There does not seem to be any work going on at all. It seems not one of the photos was ever taken on these supposed Sundays when all the visitors were there. That would have made an interesting photo, the crowds gawking at the massive building project. You would think a newspaper would want to print a photo of that. But no, I cannot find one. Just photos with no workers and 1 or 2 horse carts. What is also interesting is that in the Muriel Hested's 1904 book, referred to the fairgrounds as the City of Mighty Magicians. Is he giving a Bancroft-type sly reference to something? A few of the photos from this fair even appear to be an early form of Photoshop. One has an original photo of some guys constructing a wooden frame, but a piece of a statue that was used in the fair was obviously double exposed onto the original to make it look like it was actually there. Any photo expert can see the double exposure quite clearly. The strange black shading around the shadow in the photo is obvious. It adds to the dubious nature of the whole construction project. I want to be again clear that I believe temporary buildings were put up at these fairs, quite a lot of them actually, especially all the specialty structures along the midways. Carefully look at many of the images to reveal that the photographs present were buildings built cheaply in some cases. And that is what makes it so hard to really understand what we are seeing with these expositions. Because the final structure of some of the huge buildings cannot just be simple wood and plaster as history makes us to believe. And now that they're all long gone, none of the buildings can be checked and tested, which were plastered and weathered and painted over, or really from marble. Some construction photos clearly display utility poles. What are they for? Telephone, telegraph, electricity? And of course, how old are they? There is a suggestion that the old civilization had free wireless energy, that used utility poles without wires to move the energy, and perhaps even had a simple type of internet-like technology, and beamed that into everyone's homes. Later, the same poles had wires added to them in the 1890s to hook up to the new paid technology that we are now familiar with today. Like the stories of other fairs, this was meant to open in 1903, but also had to be delayed 1 year to get everything built. There's no way this could be built in a couple of years, but if the main buildings only had to be refurbished and painted, then perhaps the rest of the structures in the Pike might have been able to build. But once you get a glimpse later of just how big and complicated even the Pike actually was, it's hard to believe they even built that in 2 years. The only things of this exposition left today are the St. Louis Art Museum and the birdcage at the zoo. Again, why build only just one real building and fake ones for everything else? Why is there this idea that these fairs need to build just one real structure? The fair was opened in 1904 by its president Francis with these remarks, quote, "Open ye gates, spring wide ye portals, enter in, ye sons of men, and behold the achievement of your race. Learn the lessons here taught, and gather from it inspiration to still greater achievements." End quote. I found interesting that the list of it being a portal, and behold the achievements. What achievements and what race is being referred to? The exposition was massive, twice as large as Chicago, at over 1,200 acres. That's 4.9 square kilometers, with over 1,500 buildings connected by some 75 miles of roads and walkways. Chicago was only 693 acres. The Palace of Agriculture alone covered some 20 acres. Again, we're dealing with an exposition of giant structures, domes, towers, columns, arches, lakes, canals. 2 years to build from scratch 1,200 acres of buildings, roads, fountains, sewers, lagoons, and all the landscaping. There's no better place to start than the Palace of Agriculture, the exposition's largest. It measured 546 feet wide and 1,660 feet long, and had the height of an 8-story building. A walk of 3/4 of a mile was required simply to walk around it. Inside were 10,000 exhibits from 15 countries and 42 states. On the east side of its exterior was the largest rose garden in the world, covering 10 acres and displaying 1 million flowers. To the north of it was a floral clock which had 13,000 flowering plants covering its face. At night it was illuminated by over 1,000 lights. It was the largest clock in the world. Operated by compressed air, the minute hand was 75 feet long and weighed 2,700 pounds and moved 5 feet every minute. The hour hand was 50 feet long. Interestingly, cameras could be used anywhere on the fairgrounds except within the agricultural building. That piques my curiosity right there. So, what was there inside of the building that the organizers did not want anyone to photograph? For other buildings, the Palace of Fine Arts was supposedly the only permanent building. Built by Cass Gilbert, the architect who designed the United States Supreme Court building, as he often used Beaux Arts style to reflect the optimistic American sense that the nation had and was the heir of Greek democracy, Roman law, and Renaissance humanism. For the palace in St. Louis, Gilbert was heavily inspired supposedly by the Baths of Caracalla in Rome, Italy. Again, that direct imitation of specific buildings in ancient Rome. This structure was built from Bedford stone, the highest quality limestone in the United States. All the 11,000 art exhibits were on the ground floor with 134 skylights. The Mines building was 525 by 700 feet. The Transportation building, 525 by 1,300 feet. The Manufacturers building, 525 by 1,200 feet. The Electricity building, 525 by 659 feet. The Administration building was built for the university and was made to look like a Tudor English castle. The Fraternity building was 200 by 300 feet and had 80 rooms for fraternal orders. Entirely surrounded by lagoons, the Palace of Education and Social Economy was situated facing west on the Great Basin. Fairgoers gained entrance by walking over monumental bridges. Visitors can view an elementary school actually having their classes or attend a college lecture. The Festival Hall, which was used for concerts, was the centerpiece of the fair. Also designed by Cass Gilbert, it was 200 feet in diameter and 200 feet high. The Festival Hall's dome at 165 feet in diameter was larger than St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Evelyn Longman's Victory statue stood on top of the dome. The building had an auditorium for 3,500 people and the world's new largest pipe organ that had just been built by the Los Angeles Art Organ Company, which actually went bankrupt as a result of building it. The massive instrument has 10,059 pipes and was capable of 17,179,869 distinct tonal effects and needed 10 train cars to transport it to St. Louis. Afterwards, it was purchased by John Wanamaker for his new Wanamaker store in Philadelphia, where it became known as the Wanamaker organ. The famous bronze eagle in the Wanamaker store also came from the fair. In front of the festival hall are the famous cascades, a series of waterfalls in which pumps push 45,000 gallons of water a minute through man-made falls into the Grand Basin. Scott Joplin wrote the ragtime song Cascades in honor of them. The Mississippi State Building was the largest of the state buildings. Though it had sections with marble floors and heating and air conditioning, it was planned, quote, as a temporary structure. However, it burned the night of November 1819, just 11 days before the fair was to end. Most of the interior was destroyed, but some contents were rescued without damage, including some furniture and much of the contents of the fair's model library. Since the fair was almost over, the building was, quote, not rebuilt. Of course, it is interesting that the one building that claims to have real marble and even heating and air conditioning burns in a fire that destroyed only this one building. Many new inventions were presented here, such as the wireless telephone unit or the radiophone. Music or spoken messages were transmitted from an apparatus within the Palace of Electricity to a telephone receiver out in the courtyard. The receiver, which was attached to nothing, when placed to the ear, allowed the visitor to hear the transmission. This radiophone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell, consisted of a transmitter, which transformed sound waves into light waves, and a receiver which converted the light waves back into sound. This technology developed into the radio and early mobile phones. Again, I wonder how much the Palace of Electricity had with the ability of this device to work. I'm sure the tower of the palace would be working similar to a modern cell phone tower. That means they were displaying the cell phone in 1904, but could not get another one up and running, for the public anyway, until after 1990. It makes one wonder now about the supposed cell phones claimed to be seen in some 1920 silent movies. They might actually be cell phones that have this St. Louis origin. An early version of the fax machine was also presented, as was the X-ray machine. Early automobiles were on display, and here were several models powered by gasoline, steam, and electricity. Yes, they were showcasing electric cars in 1904. Just how much has been hidden from us, and for how long? Added to this was an airplane contest, which led to St. Louis getting the name the Flight City, as well as Charles Lindbergh naming his plane the Spirit of St. Louis. Another major exhibit was the infant incubator. Although infant incubators had been invented in the year 1888, they were not being well used, so they began to display them at the various world fairs. This piece of medical equipment helped the baby with a compromised immune systems by providing a sanitary environment to reduce the likelihood of acquiring an infection. Each incubator was an airtight glass box with a metal frame. Hot air was pumped into the container to keep a constant temperature. 10 nurses cared for 24 neonatal babies while in the infant incubators. The exhibit required an entrance fee of 25 cents, and visitors could also purchase souvenirs and refreshments from the adjoining shop and cafe. The Pike was the name for the fair's long midway street, and was more than just a few booths and some carnival rides. It was almost 1.5 miles long, and doctors warned weaker patients to not go out on it, for fear that they would collapse from trying to see it all. While the Chicago Ferris wheel was there, and, of course, basic rides and the like, take a gander at the world experience the visitor could enjoy in St. Louis. It so dwarfed what was in Chicago that I have to present some of it to you to get a sense of what was there, for it was like a giant worldwide travel experience accentuated by thousands of actors. Each exhibit had a giant restaurant seating as many as 3,000 people. Here are some of the exhibits. Ancient Rome was a colossal exhibit of over 400 actors employed to give the visitor the illusion of going back in time to life of the gladiators. A large arena called the Hippodrome showcased chariot races, jousting, boxing, and gladiatorial clashes with 200 persons, 40 animals, including tigers, lions, and leopards. The finale was a reproduction of Nero's Rome burning. Oddly, this is the exact Roman period I think these expositions were mirroring, discussed in Chapter 7. Tyrolean Alps was a 9-acre reproduction of the Alpine region in Bavaria, Germany. It had 21 village cottages, a cathedral, and giant mountains of staff. Visitors could ride a simulated tram car through the Alps where real cattle and goats would be in pasture. Dancers and musicians entertained the crowds. Jerusalem covered 11 acres and included 22 streets and 300 buildings. Replicas were the stable in which Jesus was said to be born, and the Golden Gate, the Mosque of Omar, and several others. Over 1,000 people from Jerusalem traveled to the United States to participate and work at the exhibit. Like at Chicago, one could walk down the streets of Cairo and smoke a water pipe, ride a camel, haggle for carpets, or walk through a replica of Luxor Temple. At the streets of Seville, one saw a replica of the Plaza de Torres in Madrid and the Gypsy Lane of Barcelona. The Great Siberian was a train ride that utilized illusion to make one believe that they were on a great cross-country Russian railway. The Irish village was entering via a replica of St. Lawrence's Gate. Paris replicated France during medieval times. There was a Constantinople, a Chinese village, and the streets of Old St. Louis. But there was more than just world trips. Frank F. Phillis produced what was called the greatest and most realistic military spectacle known in the history of the world. It was a mock battle from the recent Boer War. Different portions of the concession featured a British Army encampment, several South African native villages including Zulu, San, and Swazi, and a 15-acre arena in which soldiers paraded and major battles from the war were reenacted, with over 600 veteran soldiers from both sides. At the conclusion of the show, the Boer general Christian de Wet, portrayed by an actor of course, would escape on horseback by leaping from a height of 35 feet, 11 meters, into a pool of water. Another exhibit was Battle Abbey, designed to be a 400 by 250-foot replica of the convent near Hastings where the Normans defeated the Saxons. It was fashion complete with towers, bastions, parapet, and drawbridge. Inside was a museum of American wars with 6 huge cycloramas, including famous American battles such as Gettysburg, Yorktown, New Orleans, Buena Vista, Little Bighorn, and Manila. The Gettysburg cyclorama was 50 feet high and 400 feet in circumference. One of the many exhibits that was at this fair, perhaps the saddest, was Geronimo, Apache war chief. Once again, as with the fairs in Omaha and Buffalo, he was placed, as Wikipedia called it, on display in a teepee in the ethnology exhibit. He sold photographs for 25 cents, signed autographs for 10, 15, or 25 cents, as the case may be. Supposedly he got to keep part of the money. Others claim he did not, as he was still a prisoner of war and only let out of Oklahoma jail to attend the fairs. Many people in St. Louis invited Geronimo to come to their homes, but his keeper always refused. Every Sunday, the president of the fair sent a 74-year-old chief to go to the Wild West show, where he took part in roping contests. Geronimo had this to say about the whites: "I'm glad I went to the fair. I saw many interesting things and learned much from the white people. They are very kind and peaceful. During the time I was at the fair, no one tried to harm me in any way. Had this been among the Mexicans, I am sure I would have been compelled to defend myself often. I wish all of my people could have attended the fair." End quote. This sounds very much what a prisoner just let out of jail for a few months would say about the people who allowed him time outside. These fairs again put primitive people on display. From a documentary on the St. Louis Fair, one of the historians remarked, quote, "Fairs were the celebration of Western civilization, of its superior intellectual and scientific achievement. The firm belief was that if we could spread that around the world, everyone would be better off." End quote. Hence the primitives were shown off like animals at a zoo, who needed the great Western industrialists and Christians to come and save and fix them. Such displays included the Apache of the American Southwest and the Igorot of the Philippines, both of which peoples were described as primitive. The Cliff Dwellers was a reproduction of the caves of the southwestern United States and covered over 5 acres of ground, containing 100 dwellings, and were peopled by 300 natives of the Moki and Zuni races, including men, women, and children. For an extra 25 cents, one can enter the theater and watch the Indians perform snake and kachina dances. One could purchase authentic basket weaving, pottery, and silverwork. J.W. Buell wrote in the opening of his volume on Anthropology at the Exposition that his fairs, quote, "had an all-embracing scope in which to be seen the works of men of all races, the primitive and the barbaric, brought in contrast with the most highly civilized, that every step of progress may be observed." End quote. One positive exhibit of note was for the horse Jim Key, the educated Arabian cross horse in the Silver Horseshoe Pavilion. He was owned by Dr. William Key, an African-American Native American former slave, who became a respected self-taught veterinarian. He took the horse on a tour of the U.S. to show his philosophy of humane treatment for animals, and to show that animals have feelings and thoughts, and not just things to work in a field for labor. Jim Key could add, subtract, use a cash register, spell with blocks, tell time, and give opinions on the politics of the day by shaking his head yes or no. Dr. Key's motto was that Jim was taught by kindness instead of the whip. The fair also hosted the 1904 Summer Olympic Games at the same time, the first Olympics to be held in the United States. These games had originally been awarded to Chicago, but when St. Louis threatened to hold a rival international competition, the games were relocated. Nonetheless, the sporting events, spread out over several months, were overshadowed by the fair. With travel expenses high, many European athletes did not attend. Many of the events were bogus, and the marathon turned out to be the strangest race maybe ever run, with the winner taking rat poison before the race and another using a taxi cab to try to get to the finish line first. Then the fair was dismantled. The Chicago Wrecking Company won the contract and had it dismantled in less than 2 months. All of the buildings, structures, and statues were said to be buried in 3 landfills. I would love to see those landfills to see how much marble might still be in them. This fair again lost money, a lot of money. Total cost to build was $15 million. Total return, $6.4 million. That's a loss of $8.6 million, or $231 million in today's money. They keep losing massive amounts of money, yet they keep putting on these fairs. Why, you have to ask. Why, indeed. But strange is not the word as we head towards the Exposition in San Francisco. That is because this exposition happened just 9 years after its great earthquake of 1906 that made the city look like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So yes, the best thing one can do is put up 400-acre buildings to be used only for a few months, then tear them all down. Who needs housing and buildings after a completely devastating earthquake? Apparently, not San Francisco.